that's where you're really like practicing interior silence in that sense, is when you're choosing, to try not to be attached to these things that keep coming up. Because it's not the absence of interior noise. It's not the absence of all these thoughts and movements that constitute like real Christian interior silence. It's not clinging to them. It's not feeling like you have to chase them down or let them define you or identify yourself with them. It's that keeping your eyes on Jesus, being present to him as best you can. That's what will enable that space to develop. That's what will enable it always starts with love.
Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome back to CarmelCast. CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies publications. For more information, you can visit our website at www.icspublications.org. And we're continuing today with our season on Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity. And in this episode, we're specifically going to be talking about her understanding of silence. And I think that this is something that's very, very important for the world right now, really. I think, saints come to us at different times. They have different messages to share with the world. And I think that this is a message in particular that our world really needs to hear. My name is Brother John Mary of Jesus Crucified, and I'm joined today by Father Michael Joseph of St. Therese as we dive into this very important topic.
Yes. Well, I think you said it. It's probably more necessary than ever. And in some ways, too, you can say Elizabeth, they call her the prophet of the presence of God. Mm-hmm. And I would say she's also a prophet of interior silence, yes. Really. I mean, that's what enabled her to be so attentive to the presence of God.
Yeah.
And you think of, what we struggle with so much, maybe it's not the external noise as much right now, People aren't always necessarily like listening to the radio blasting anymore as they were maybe in our parents' generation. Or But with phones, you can have your headphones in. Everything might look quiet. You could be in your room all day, your solitude, right, in your room, and yet you're filling yourself with so much noise, and not just noise in terms of like actual physical noise within you, but ideas, thoughts, images, stirring up things in you, contradictory desires, all this stuff that it can create a kind of almost inner confusion that I think a lot of young people especially deal with and don't know how to process.
Yes.
And so all the more do we need someone to kind of show us what is the path to interior silence.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great way for us to start here is by just right at the beginning saying, we're not just talking about the exterior noise of our lives. Really what we're talking about is the interior noise more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I think most people have a sense of what that is, especially if you try to go somewhere and just sit and be still and quiet for an amount of time. You'll notice this interior movement. Maybe movement is another word for it too. Yeah. This lack of stillness, this lack of peace, welling up within you. That comes from, like you said, all these things in our world, from even just a lot of the media we consume, but also just how complicated our world is. This is all, we're consuming it,
yes.
And it becomes a part of us.
Well, and we tend to escape too, like our painful emotions and our thoughts, our memories, that we don't want to deal with. And so we escape them by going into more noise.
Right.
And then that creates even more turmoil inside. So then when we do have that time for quiet, even those other things, those painful part of our lives maybe surge up and we don't know what to do with them.
Yeah.
Don't know what to do with that silence.
Yeah, we're certainly a culture that's just living in this place of interior noise. Mm-hmm. That's where Elizabeth comes to us and really offers us something to us today in this respect. But of course, she wasn't immune to this either. It's not that she grew up in a time that was totally, not filled with these things. She was right in the midst of it.
Oh yeah. I mean, in any time in history, it's going to be a similar struggle. We could say maybe it's intensified in some way in our own time, but yes, she definitely had that. I mean, just think of when we talked about her experience as a child too, just the inner turmoil that she experienced that expressed itself in great anger and losing her temper. There's a lot of interior noise there that probably, with a lot of the saints, the reason they became so known for a certain virtue, let's say, it's because it was the very thing that they had to struggle with the most. So you can see in Elizabeth's desire for silence, her focus on silence, that was probably a big part of her own interior battle.
Right. Yeah, it's funny to think that the little girl who was brought out of the church because she was screaming and throwing a fit is the one that today we're talking about as being the saint of silence.
Yes, which gives us all hope. That's the beauty of it too. It's that you don't have to have enter into some specific state of life or some, reach some spiritual stage to start striving for silence. That she was able to strive for that even at a young age and really attain it in many ways. Not, and we'll go into that, what that means, but not necessarily through her own effort, but a real grace, a real openness, a receptivity that she had that was remarkable for a young woman, even before she entered Carmel.
Yeah, and maybe even to a degree, to the extent that we are aware that we're interiorly disquieted is a grace in itself, because it means the noise isn't so loud that we're just unable to even notice it at this point. It's no, when we're noticing these things, it's a grace, because it becomes an invitation for us to address the noise, to try to find a place of more interior peace.
Exactly. That the awareness, just being aware really is a great grace, and it shows too, again, that there's something in us if we're fighting it, and we desire this. As Saint Therese would say, God doesn't inspire unrealizable desires. So if we see this as a real goal for our life, we can really trust that God put that in our heart, and He wants us to have that interior peace, interior silence. And it's not something unattainable. But it, with Elizabeth, it has a certain angle. It's not just a value in itself. Right. And that's another key thing I think that we have to keep in mind.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And it's connected always to God for her. Because I think perhaps even in a natural sense, there's a way in which people can, enter into these maybe very secular practices of meditation and interior quieting, which could be very beneficial for them. But where Elizabeth is going is a different direction.
Exactly. It's all theological. Her silence is just so theological. It's always turned towards the other. It's all about presence. Yes. It's all about listening. It's all about, attention to the other. And it gives a good lens through which to see Elizabeth. It wasn't just a seeking for well-being, let's say, or a kind of just trying to better herself.
Self-help.
Exactly. Although it did help her. That's
right? Exactly.
It helped her more than anything else would.
Yeah.
But it was because it was directed in this other way that it bore such tremendous fruit in her life.
Yeah. You said a very key word there, which I want to consider in the life of Elizabeth, and that was listening. And we know, from her childhood, she started studying the piano at a very young age. She was 8 years old when she started taking piano lessons, and she was actually, extremely talented when it came to piano. And this meant that, I think naturally, even before this perhaps, but she had a great gift for listening. She had a great ear. And that's something that I think allows her to be this prophet of silence to us. Because I know even, from my own studies of music, how important silence is for music. And it's absolutely essential, really, because same for speaking, right? If there isn't the silence in between my words, then you can't distinguish the words or the letters even from each other, sounds from one another. And so, often you'll hear in music teachers say, you have to play the rests. Play the rest. So even the silence between the notes, you have to play them. It's equally as important as the music itself. And so this is something that, in a natural way, Elizabeth had this great gift for this ear for listening. And I think that's really made her so receptive to the graces that God wanted to give her in this area of her life.
Yes, for sure. And as a teenager, when she was, so apt at playing and so in tune, they said that it was like when she played, it was just like her whole being, was giving itself to music. There was an ability to be present, I guess, already in her. Yes. Not just a natural ability necessarily, but a real graced kind of characteristic to be present. And you can see that even in her, when she would go to parties and things like that. she would be very present to people. They always noticed her eyes, like she was always just like attentive to them, and her gaze is what struck people the most. But she would also write at these very parties how she would always like, take, I don't even know what you want to say, a moment, but she would just to remember the presence of God, just to be with him in a sense in the midst of all these other things. So she really had as her aim to just, quiet herself in a way, to remain with God, even in the midst of a lot of noise going on,
Right.
Externally, but I think you could even say internally too.
Yeah.
So it's not just like this absence of noise that somehow she discovered or she was able to attain somehow by all this effort, but it was an ability to be present, to be silent, in that sense, to choose silence in the midst of whatever was going on around her, whether she was in parties, whether she was, being criticized by her mom and trying to fight that anger, or, you know what I mean? But she had that gift, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and maybe we can dive into this a little more later in the episode, but I do think it's interesting to talk about that relationship between interior and exterior silence, because really what Elizabeth had was this interior silence that she could keep anywhere, in the midst of a party, in the midst of the loudest thing you can imagine. It's something that's within her, and so she can keep that peace and that place, that space for God. And yet external silence is also very important too, and we have to realize the way that when we consume a lot of noise, again, whether that be actual noise or just information, images, things to distract us, like how that's going to have ramifications for our interior state.
Yes, and that is a good point. Like there is a basic discipline that helps interior silence grow, and not always choosing noise, just even good noise, even a podcast, even CarmelCast, maybe not CarmelCast. It probably really helps with the interior.
Yeah, okay. Turn off the podcast right now. Go into prayer.
But just simply, turning off that stuff, even if it's good stuff, but allowing yourself to have that time, that silence, does help it develop, and it does provide an environment, for interior silence. So we don't want to, external silence is good insofar as it is conducive to interior silence, I guess you could say.
Exactly. And that's why, Elizabeth took her times of prayer and external silence very seriously as well. Okay. And it's one thing, perhaps, maybe the podcast age, or even just, I'm thinking of like wireless headphones now, how easy it is to always be listening to something. Whereas before, maybe like, you'd get in the car and then you'd listen to something. But now it's like you're in the car, you're listening, and then you get out of the car and you're walking and you're listening, and you're in the grocery store and you're listening. And again, very good things sometimes, very good things. So it's not a matter of totally rejecting those, but making specific time in your life to say, maybe I should just be present to my reality. Maybe I should go out for a walk and leave all that behind for a time. Like you said, insofar as it helps me to enter into that interior silence.
Exactly. And there's a fear, I think, that somehow we're missing out. Like if I could, especially those who want a deeper spiritual life, like if I just could like consume as much good spiritual stuff as possible, that's going to help me grow. And that's, and it's like, I don't want to waste time. Maybe I don't have much time. And so I want to use that little time I have to kind of feed myself, nourish myself. And that's all good. But ultimately, the most nourishing thing we can do is being quiet and still before the Lord, And so to choose those moments, like you said, maybe it's not even a specific moment of prayer, but just to turn things off and just be with the Lord, whatever you're doing.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate our listeners, but if you're listening and you feel drawn to interior prayer right now, turn this off.
Yeah.
We'd much rather you listen to the Lord than to us. Yeah. Another thing from Elizabeth's childhood that really struck me was, she had a real appreciation for beauty in nature, and those were things that really drew her into silence. Again, exterior, but also more so interior silence. And then connected to that is also this idea of solitude, which Elizabeth very often connects with the idea of silence, and just how with silence, she doesn't mean just exterior silence. When she's talking about solitude, she's not just talking about an exterior solitude either. She's actually more so talking about an interior solitude. And there's a great letter that she writes when she's pretty young. She's writing to her friend about, she's vacationing with her family. And she explained, that they're in the country and just how beautiful the trees are and how she's really, enjoying the time in the woods. And she's explaining what they do every day. And then she says, I would like to have you share my solitude, for we are living all together like hermits. And it's very striking. Joanne Mosley, her biography, points out that she's inviting someone to share in her solitude, which just shows that she has this very rich understanding of solitude. The presence of another isn't ruining this place of solitude. And so by solitude, really what she means is this, again, space or awareness of the presence of God and being alone with him in that place, which again I can do anywhere.
Exactly. It's not you're trying to protect yourself, or it's not out of fear that you're entering into solitude in that sense.
Yeah.
It's in order to be more present to the other. And there's such a joy in that. It's like people want it, like when you're in love, you just want to be with the one you love,
Yes.
and sometimes there's other people around, and that's nice, but then eventually you want to go off, and not be with them. And again, it's that solitude. It's so relational, I guess. Her solitude, her silence is so relational. It's not trying to put up walls to guard herself and not be vulnerable, let's say,
Yeah.
But it's to just totally enter into love that she saw was so necessary. And I'd say even in the sense of the crucified one too, that was always big. Even before Carmel, she saw silence as the way that she could be present to the crucified one, so she could just be open to him, even when it's hard and it's painful. So it could be a painful solitude, but it takes away that edge because you're with the crucified one who loves you. You know.
Yeah. One thing we know well from our novitiate in Carmel is our novice master was very insistent that we spend a certain amount of time in our cell each day, basically just being there, and it was exactly for this purpose of being in our room. In silence, in solitude. And again, it wasn't so concerned about like what we're doing in there, but it was just like to have that awareness and that space.
Yes.
Again, space I think is so important. Presence, we're going to talk about a lot, like the relationality and presence to another, but presence and space, like these two ideas seem so central here. And it's to have this space to encounter the Lord, who he's always trying to speak to us.
Yes.
But we have to give him that place.
Exactly. And that goes so much too into like how Elizabeth saw her own name, her own identity as house of God. It was like even from a younger age, she saw that like the best thing she could do for God was be hospitable towards him. And so by creating that space, like you're basically giving God permission to love you. You're giving him free reign to just be who he wants to be in you. And what greater way is there to honor God than to give him space, basically?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting though that when we make that space, when we shut off some of the noise, again, not necessarily external, but even just like internally try to make that space, we find that a lot of things start coming up though. That being loved is not, or making space for love is not always an easy thing.
Yes. I mean, you could say even like there's certain moments where it might come easier. There's certain moments where you're just graced in a special way in that moment, or you're just in awe over the beauty that you see or something that hits you. But other times it's not that way. And yet, so I think that's the important thing too. I mean, even again, people in love, let's say, sometimes they're just present to the other. They don't need any help to do that, Other times it's probably really hard to be present to the other, and you're distracted by your own stuff, and they're trying to tell you their stuff, and you might love them, but you're not there maybe, or you want to be there, but it's not easy to be there, and so but that's where really, that's where the grace is. I mean, that's where you're really like practicing interior silence in that sense, is when you're choosing, to try not to be attached to these things that keep coming up. Because it's not the absence of interior noise. It's not the absence of all these thoughts and movements that constitute like real Christian interior silence. It's not clinging to them. Yes. It's not feeling like you have to chase them down or let them define you or identify yourself with them. Yeah. It's almost just like letting them be and being okay that they're there, and then not even paying attention as best you can.
Yeah.
Even though when it's difficult.
Yeah. And so much of this, of course, relates to the teaching of Teresa of Avila prayer, and John of the Cross too. But, Teresa writes quite a bit about distractions in prayer. That's exactly what we mean here by interior noise, are these distractions too. And she suffered from her distractions. I mean, she really, it was difficult for her. But it's interesting how I think sometimes we try to fight that. Again, I'm not just talking about the time of prayer either, but even outside of prayer, maybe we try to fight or like block off. And I don't know if that's even the right approach. It's like you said, it's to almost let them be. Because in some sense, the noise, the interior noise, I don't know, I think of it like a river. Our imaginations are like this river that's running through our brain, and that's how we work as human beings. That's what allows us to be creative. That's what allows us to have new ideas. Like, that's a great thing. And that's a good thing, because it means I'm working the way I should. Exactly. My brain's working the way I should. The problem is in our latching onto them, our trying to control them, our attempts to or maybe just our inability to let them be.
Yes, exactly. And that, again, I think that's a very good point, because like if it was the case that we just wanted to have like absence, like then if you were like catatonic, that would be a good thing,
right.
Or just sleep. I could just sleep and that'd be great, because I'm not thinking about anything. But that's not it at all. That's not at all. Yeah, it's like we're trying to live every moment as if we're in prayer, basically, and not that we're focusing on praying, but it's like that's the whole Carmelite path. I mean, that's the whole Christian path that Jesus says, pray at all times without ceasing. It's trying to be present to God no matter what. So what Teresa says about distractions and prayer, you can apply that at all the time, like in every moment. And even with Saint Elizabeth, where she talks about not letting yourself get caught in any useless thought. You notice a useless thought, just letting it go. So not just during prayer time, it's not just during being distracted, but it's trying to make that spirit of prayer, that spirit of being present, all like throughout your whole day,
right?
And not allowing yourself to just get sucked in by your noise and going after it, trying to resolve it all, trying to dig into it.
Yeah. Well, because what happens, I mean, when we're trying to control or to latch on to these thoughts is exactly, we're trying to control it instead of being passive to God.
Yes.
And also we're sticking onto something when God might be sending something else to speak to us. God's always speaking to us in the present moment. And often we're like living in what just happened,
exactly
an hour ago or a few days ago, or in the future of our anxieties about what's about to happen. But we have to, again, let go of those to allow the space for the Holy Spirit, who's really the one who speaks to us interiorly, so we can hear his voice. We have to listen to him.
And that's, I think, where you get this whole sense of, with Saint Elizabeth, of forgetfulness of self, because so much of her silence was geared towards just trying to be forgetful of self in a healthy way, in a healthy way. Meaning, because when you're trying to control it, like you mentioned, or trying to think about the future or the past, the ego is so there.
Yeah.
It's really, that's where self is so strong, and self is what causes the most noise. It's our attachment to self. It's our, trying to make our ego or our self, whatever you want to call it, the kind of the center. Even in our own fighting, let's say we're upset or frustrated at the interior noise that I can't quite overcome when I'm trying to pray or whatever. Just that letting yourself get frustrated over it is creating more noise than would have to be there, because yourself now is really trying to come in there, and so I think that's one key for her for interior silence is also forgetfulness of self.
And I mean, Elizabeth, again, she struggled with these things, and that's why she can be the one to teach us. I mean, she struggled with this interior noise. I mean, I think specifically we referred to her childhood, the kind of the anger, her sensitivity, the frustrations there. But even continuing on in her life, the kind of the real darkness that she went into when she first entered Carmel.
Yes.
Just how much that would have been, she could have just turned in on that noise and just remained in that. And yet it seems like, I think through that process, she was really taught to let go and then experience some real graces in prayer.
Yes.
Because of that openness.
I was always struck reading her biography how during her novitiate, when she did have those real struggles, it was like these weird scruples too, like things that just weren't natural to her, like about like fulfilling, the rubrics of prayer that they had to do, and all these different things about being a Carmelite that like she didn't feel like she was doing well, and was she offending God? Like, these things that were causing her this turmoil. And she didn't have just that peaceful, gentle, natural silence that she was maybe had before. She would go before the Blessed Sacrament on Sundays still when she had the free time, and just still be there. And I think it was one witness said you could like almost see her trembling, just trying to be present, just trying to not give in to the noise, trying to not let it consume her.
Yeah.
And so it was that effort, in the midst of the darkness of trying to constantly be present, choose silence regardless, that really honed her and shaped her to who she was.
And we can maybe think in that experience, that struggle, when we can't quiet ourselves, we could get, like you said, get frustrated about it, which is probably the worst thing that we can do. But if we can kind of change our mindset and say, in some sense, it's a grace, because God is allowing these things to teach me something, to purify these things. He's allowing these things to well up within me in order to teach me to let go.
Yes.
And that purification of letting go can't happen very often unless those things come up.
Exactly.
And so it's a necessary, like it was for Elizabeth, it's this necessary process. So we shouldn't get be so hard on ourselves. Like, I'm just so far from this, from sanctity, because I experience all this interior noise. It's like, no, that's exactly where the Lord wants you to be and where he wants to purify.
And the very fact that you're conscious of that shows that you care about it that much.
Right.
And you can still make choices towards it, even if you feel like you're failing all the time, or it's not quite working as you would want it to, or think it should work, but you're making those choices towards it.
Yeah. And a little later on, Elizabeth, I think, shortly after these struggles, she noticed a big transition in her prayer where she was really drawn to more silent prayer. And maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit too, what that experience was maybe like for her. Because I know at first she had some scruples even about her own silence in prayer. She felt like she needed to be doing something. And yet her desire was just to be silent with the Lord.
Yes, and it's kind of classic St. John of the Cross, right? Where when God is kind of transitioning you to a more silent, receptive, open type of prayer, as opposed to something more active or more like, it's you kind of churning there. There is this scruple that can come up that I'm not doing anything, that I'm being idle, that I'm not actually helping, and Elizabeth, even though she had passed that point probably a while back, but it would still come up every once in a while, and yet she said when she would kind of give into that a little bit, there's a nice quote where she says, "Our Lord inwardly gave her to understand that the reparation he was asking of her was to allow him to hide himself in her, and she entered into his silence totally consoled and pacified." So it's like God is saying, like, yeah, you could pray these novenas and do these penances that you think, would be more fruitful, but like all I want is just to be with you. And so you, like, what you desire most of all is actually what will give me the most glory, and what will be reparative, you could say, what would repair sins against me, by just allowing me to love you and allowing me to welcome me into your interior.
Elizabeth was really able to see her silence as a gift then. Like, that's what she was giving to the Lord, to such an extent that, when some of the sisters were talking about, different things that they were going to do or to give to the Lord in preparation for a feast, Elizabeth would just, they'd ask her, well, what will you do? And she says, I'll be quiet. I'll just be silent. And so much so that it was said, the sisters like to make fun of this. They'd anticipate that that's what she was going to say. But there's something so beautiful there. This isn't coming from a place of laziness or not desiring to do something. It's that she realizes that all that she can do is nothing compared to what God can do. And so the best thing that she can give is just her receptivity to allow him to be the one who does it.
Yeah, and it shows, I think, too, her confidence in her path, even though all she wanted to do was be a good Carmelite, and she saw these other sisters around her doing these things, but she was so confident that this was her calling, that this was her path that God had put her on. And So she didn't let herself, get dissuaded by the comments or being made fun of a little bit, and they respected it for sure. But she was just, she saw that this is the best thing that she could do,
Right.
and she saw this as like the vocation of heaven. I mean, she wanted to live her heaven on earth through faith, right? So, and she said to a seminarian, quoting a sermon that she had heard, that the saints live in silence, recollected, and their only job is to be receptive, receptive beings. And so if that's what heaven will be, is just total receptivity to like God's complete gift of self, pouring himself into us, and then giving that back to him, pouring us back to him, then it's kind of like, why not do that now?
Yes, yeah. And my mind, of course, immediately goes to Our Lady, which maybe we'll get to a little bit later. But I also just want to mention that a lot of this is especially relating to silence and prayer. It's something that we discussed in one of our episodes on the Living Flame of Love. I think it was one of the episodes on stanza 3 of the Living Flame of Love. So if people are interested in learning more about this call to more silent prayer, that would be a great place to go. St. John of the Cross has really just excellent teaching on this topic. And also I'm just reminded of something that I'll often tell directees, is that if in prayer you feel drawn to more quiet, simpler prayer, like always take that invitation. Yeah. Always take that invitation. Like,
don't be afraid.
Yeah, that's from the Holy Spirit.
And you think now more than ever, in a sense, because we're so afflicted by noise. Yeah. And as Paul says, where sin abounds, grace abounds, or St. John of the Cross, where when evil bears its face more, all the more does God pour out his treasures. Yes. And so in our age, maybe these are the treasures that God especially wants to pour out more than ever. Right. Are these contemplative graces, and to not be afraid to go with it. You don't have to think that I have to be some great saint or, be great in my own eyes before I can be brought into this kind of prayer, that God is very generous, and it's always a gift. Mm-hmm.
One experience I remember from my novitiate is, I've always been very devoted to the Rosary, praying the Rosary every day since I first really started praying the Rosary in college, and I was praying the Rosary every single day. It was a very important part of my spiritual life. And I remember at one point during my novitiate, I think I was beginning to enter more into interior silence for the first time in my life. And I remember speaking with my novice master and explaining how I was struggling to pray the Rosary because I just wanted to like sit there and be with Our Lady and just in silence. And it wasn't that I wasn't praying or I was letting my mind go elsewhere. I would start praying the Rosary, and then I would just want to be there with her. And so he really encouraged me in that. And that was so helpful for me and freeing for me, because I had this mindset of like, no, I have to finish the Rosary. I have to finish the Rosary. And he's like, you can pray the Rosary later. Like, take that opportunity, that invitation. Yeah. If you have time later, great, you can finish praying the Rosary. But we can get attached again to very good things in the spiritual life. The Rosary is so good. So I'm not saying not to pray the Rosary, but I am saying that when we're drawn to that place of silence, and just it's almost like the point of the Rosary is to bring us to Our Lady, who brings us to Jesus. Exactly. And when we've reached that destination, then we can just rest there.
Yeah. And that precisely, like, if that's what God wants most of all, then how are we giving him most glory? It's just to let him be who he is. Let him do what he wants. And it's in that silent, receptive kind of prayer, and also where we let go of our own ideas sometimes of what we think our spiritual life should be, and what we think that our prayer should be like, what we think means, for us spiritual growth. Like, sometimes God wants to break those schemas a little bit in our lives, and he definitely did with Elizabeth, and it's okay that's love, is letting him do that and not being afraid. And novitiate is such a great time for him to break our certain things like that in our life, Yes. That's so
it's really learning to let the Holy Spirit lead us, and not be so attached to our own conceptions of what prayer is, of what sanctity is. Holiness is being with him, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth really saw her silence too. It's rooted in the gospel, and I think we have to be careful that it's not some esoteric kind of reality. It's not some just sort of just in the clouds, or just kind of some alternate reality that she's trying to access, some other state of consciousness or something. It's rooted in the gospel, and it's all from Jesus, what he says in the Lord's Prayer, to go into your room, to close the door, and remain in secret with your heavenly Father, who sees you in secret and rewards you in secret. And so in that, little kernel is that's in the silence of Christ on the mountain, like it's also rooted in the gospel, and the silence of Our Lady, the silence of Our Lady. I don't know if maybe you could speak to that, how Elizabeth identified herself in that way.
Yeah, I mean, we see Our Lady really as this, in Scripture, as the perfect example of silence. But again, it's not just that exterior silence. It's more about this place of openness and receptivity. So much so that she was open and receptive to receive the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and to bear forth Jesus. And so that's, it seems more than anyone else, that seems to be who, or the model that Elizabeth is really working towards in her spiritual life.
Yeah, and it's interesting when she, like the most beautiful quote, it's in the last retreat. I forget exactly what day it's in, but one of the most beautiful kind of quotes she gives, or paragraphs even, on Our Lady, is in the context of the visitation with Mary's silence, which is interesting because the visitation is seen as like, that's where Mary's charity towards her neighbor, the active life, right? And yet Elizabeth, that's what she comments, is it says, with what recollection, with what silence, of the word within her, Mary carried out these works of charity, so it just shows too how Mary's silence is so rooted and so connected to her charity, her love, her active life, a life that was probably very noisy around her, right. In a little town, and all these relatives around you all the time. And
you're saying it's not totally quiet in first century Palestine.
I mean, 16th century paintings make it look that way, but yes. I don't know if we could really say that.
Yeah. No, that's true, and this is really where you see the wedding of Martha and Mary. We often hear about these two as the example of, Martha is the one who's busy about many things, and Mary's the one who's staying there in prayer. But in the Blessed Virgin Mary, we see these two things totally united, and that's what we're called to be too. It's not one or the other. It's how. When we find this place of interior silence, we can actually be the most active, the most busy, the most loud, but still be working from this place of intimacy, silent union with Jesus within our souls.
Yeah, and it's through faith, right? It's through faith. It's not through a feeling of recollection necessarily, or a great feeling of, I don't know, holiness. Sometimes we get those holy feelings. It's not. That's not where necessarily it's found. But it's faith. It's faith in the presence, and you can always go back to that silence through faith. And how faith and love really help kind of create that space too.
Yeah.
And so that was Elizabeth. I mean, Elizabeth identified with that so much because that's how she saw her own path. And with Mary and Carmel and everything together, that's how she saw her own identity with Our Lady.
Yeah. And then speaking of that receptivity, I'm such a visual person, so I just imagine it like making space, like literally within my soul, like making this room for this place for interaction, for encounter with God. We see perhaps the work that does go into that too, though. Yeah. Like there's something for us to do to help prepare that space.
Well, I think another word for it is detachment. I mean, the work of detachment is probably the most closest kind of, I guess you could say, virtue that would be connected to silence. Where I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road in our spiritual life, is like letting things go, when they come up, and letting the passions, as St. John the Cross says, like the joy, our hope, right? Our sorrow, you help me out here. Fear. Letting those things be so focused on God that it's not that we're kind of focusing them on God or creating space, but it's that when the things come up that divert us away from God in those areas, or that are threatening our interior peace, we do our best to let them go, and space is developed, and our passions are focused on God in that way. So I really think detachment is the work that you could say synonymous with silence in a sense. It's
Yes.
is any, as St. Elizabeth said, any useless thought, even the slightest useless thought, fleeing from it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny too, because I find this inner working between nature and grace, but also like our work and our openness to God's work. It's almost like this circle that closes in on itself, because there's also a sense in like even that we can't do on our own, and we have to rely on God. So like how do we let go of those things to make the space for God? And it's often by keeping our eyes on Jesus.
Exactly.
Like if we're so focused on getting rid of the things or making the space, that very often makes it worse. And it's like, well, what can I do? It's like, just keep your eyes on Jesus.
Yeah.
Like that is the way.
I always remember one of the greatest experts on St. Louis of the Trinity. I had the joy of meeting. He's a Maltese friar, Father Juan de Bono. And he said, when I asked him about silence in Elizabeth, he said, oh, her silence was love. That's what gave her silence, was love.
Yes.
And so it's that keeping your eyes on Jesus, being present to him as best you can. That's where the fight comes in. That's that greatest work of detachment. And then the things will, not that we'll always feel like we're doing a great job letting things go, but if we can do that, that's what will enable that space to develop. That's what will enable it always starts with love.
Yeah. It's not necessarily about not having those distractions or those preoccupations or those worries. It's instead about those can be the very space that allows God then to come in to push those out, like to allow Jesus to come in and push those out. It can be the invitation for us to allow him to come in and to make that space. So I guess the reason I stress that is because I think often we imagine that what this looks like is just this kind of Zen-like state of nothing. And that's not it. There's still in Elizabeth, sure, there are times of exceptional grace when perhaps we just reach a state of interior peace and quiet.
The faculties are suspended, as Holy Mother talks about.
Right, yes. But that's an exception. That's not the rule. Like what Elizabeth's talking about here is something we can live day in and day out. Yeah. And that is something different. There's the thoughts are still coming. The distractions are still coming. The preoccupations are still coming. But they're not. They don't stop there. Yes. They become this place, this invitation to say like, no, Jesus, I'm turning to you instead, and letting them go.
Well, it's the great fulfillment of the Easter proclamation, right? The "Oh happy fault."
Yes.
Oh necessary sin of Adam, which gained for us so great a Redeemer. I think that's the old translation, but but it shows how God works all things to the good. So then, our distractions, our own noise, become the opportunity to just keep choosing love, to keep choosing him, and not in like a forceful way either. It's not like we have to be so like self-conscious or feel like guilty because we're having all these other thoughts or something, or be so like forcing it. It's just like a gentle process of trying to loosen one's grip on things because we realize they're not God, and we only want to cling to God. Yeah. And so as things come up, we try to loosen our grip on them, and we do it for love, and it's love that makes it possible. And the things themselves, like you say, become the space to do it.
Right. And this is such an interior, mysterious reality. So it's hard to talk about. But if we're going to try to get real practical, like you're driving to work, like what is that? How do you do that? Like what? It's probably different for different people, right? But what is that interior movement like? It's one thing just to say to let them go. Yeah. But like what's happening internally?
Well, I think for one, you don't close your eyes.
If you're driving, don't close your eyes.
That'd be one key part. But no, I think it's just, honestly, just making an act of faith that God is there and being present, trying to be present to that reality of God there. And however that resonates in your interior, it's hard. We're all different, how that might, and the way to get to those acts of faith or the way to make those acts of faith. But then it's almost just trying not to chase things down. I don't know. I think of that game, that whack-a-mole game, It's like, you just keep whacking the moles and we can be driving for half an hour and all we're doing is whacking moles, and then they just keep coming back up. So it's almost just like letting yourself lose that game, let the moles come
and
up, come and go, but you're just trying to just be present to what you're doing. You're just being present to driving. You're maybe saying a couple words here and there to God, or whatever kind of keeps you, that faith, that act of faith, sort of persistent. But everyone's so different. But yeah, it's like, but that's a good. I appreciate that concreteness.
Yeah, and maybe one way it can present itself practically is more like by being so focused on what it is that God's calling us to do in that moment and how He's calling us to love. So, like, for example, if I'm with my family and I could maybe get someone says something hurtful to me, I could maybe just turn in on myself and focus on that and really fixate on this thing. Or it's like, no, I can just focus on loving the other, being attentive to the other person, just letting that go. Or even if it's like I'm by myself and I'm working, like, what is it that God's calling me to be attentive to right now? That's where He wants to encounter me. And so that becomes the focus. It's not even necessarily like explicitly turning my mind to God.
No.
But He's there.
Yes.
He's there in all of it. So it's not doing that either. But it's that's how we pray always, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not just like being good at making mental efforts or something, because that's.
Or constantly praying like the Our Father over and over again in my mind.
Yes. And not to, they're in the East, especially in the Eastern Orthodox and the Byzantine Catholic tradition, there is the Jesus prayer, and that's a very...
It's a tool to help you...
Exactly.
...to find that place of constant prayer. It in itself isn't the constant prayer so much.
Exactly, and that's what they're going for, is silence. Hesychasm, which is the word for that spirituality, means silence in Greek. So that's what they're striving for through that prayer. So it's kind of whatever helps you do that. But I like, too, what you said, like, when there's... Especially when egotistical thoughts come up, like whether it's hurt or... exaltation, they can be wildly in the same minute. One can follow the other. It's like being aware of that and just not going for it, not letting yourself get consumed by it. And making that choice to
and connected to that, I think a lot of people struggle with self-doubt, and those intrusive thoughts come in, and it's just a matter of being like, rejecting them and saying like, no, I'm a beloved son of God. That's who I am.
You don't identify.
So simple.
Exactly. And for some people where it's like a pathological condition for these intrusive thoughts, it's still possible to have silence. It's still possible. They might still come, but you're doing your best to not let them. To not identify yourself with them. And to make those acts of faith. I'm a beloved child of God.
And the reason. I mean, the reason why it's possible is because of God's grace. And really, I think Elizabeth's help, I think we should ask for her help in this when it comes to searching for this place of interior silence, because she saw so much that was her mission.
Yes, and it's worth quoting that mission again. So she says, I think, this is right before she dies, I think that in heaven my mission will be to draw souls by helping them to go out of themselves in order to cling to God by a wholly simple and loving movement, and to keep them in this great silence within, which will allow God to communicate Himself to them and transform them into Himself. And I think you really have, you could unpack that in so many ways. But it's that refusal to just cling to the particular, to set yourself on something that's so less than God, and to allow yourself to just be present, just be present as best you can to this loved one who's with you, who's always with you, and in a sense is heaven, even on this earth.
And Elizabeth's saying she's there to help us. She's there to help us with this. So ask for her help.
Yes.
This is where I think this is why she's so much needed in our world today, is because she can help to bring us through her prayers. She can help to bring us to this place of interior silence.
Yes. And asking her help, reading her writings, all these things can give us tools to keep moving in this direction.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can close with just one more thought then. And that's about something that's, even more mysterious and beautiful, really. And that's about this idea of this Elizabeth's idea of this, the silence of heaven, like the goal that we're striving for. She describes heaven and what we'll be doing in heaven as just was singing and praise, but also silence.
Mm-hmm. It's not, yeah, the silence of the divine silence, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's this the Trinitarian silence. It's this the fullness of life, and movement and love.
Yeah.
But it's sharing in that,
Mm-hmm.
it's being able to share in that, where it's this the silence of meaning total receptivity, total listening in that way, total docility
Yes.
to God's inflowing love, and just living in that dynamic,
Yeah.
receiving it. It's like breath, breathing it in, breathing it out, as St. John the Cross would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, again, Our Lady is the perfect model of that. What you said there reminds me of, really, I think in Elizabeth's understanding of silence, there's almost these two kinds of silence, or these two phases of silence. And the one is the silence needed, the space that's needed to hear God, to listen to God, making that room. But then it's almost, why do we make the room? Why do we listen? It's to hear something. But what is it that's heard for Elizabeth is silence.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why it's silence is, I mean, in the great teachings of John of the Cross and many of the other saints and mystics, is that God is so much beyond our ability to comprehend, so much beyond our ability to put into words or to noise even. And so God communicated to us. It is just this loving silence. Maybe we can close then with this. This is my favorite poem by St. Elizabeth of the Trinity. It's her poem number 115. And really for me, it really summarizes her entire spiritual journey and the path that we're called to follow. She says, "See Laudum Glorie's humble boat. It has just made, O Mother, such a wonderful trip. Through a peaceful night in deepest silence, it softly sailed on the vast ocean. Everything was at rest under the vault of the sky, and seemed to hear the voice of God cry out. But suddenly arose some deep swells, and the frail vessel vanished beneath the waves. It was the Trinity who was opening wide its breast to me, and I have found my center in the divine abyss. I shall no longer be seen on the edge of the shore. I dive into the infinite. There is all my inheritance. My soul rests in this immensity and lives with its three as if in eternity."
Well, it's great to be able to talk about this very deep and maybe it's sometimes abstract theme, but I think it has such great concrete repercussions for our life. So thank everyone for joining us, and hope to see you in the next episode.
God bless you.